We're living through the greatest economic and social transformation in modern history. For the better part of the past 100 years or 200 years, the better part of the past millennia, in fact, for all of history as we know it, we created wealth, we grew our cities, we grew our countries, we grew the world economy by harnessing natural resources and by building giant factories and giant cities, by using human physical labor combined with those God-given gifts of natural resources and raw materials. In fact, economists had a simple equation to account for this. If you wanted to understand where economic growth and higher living standards, wealth came from, you as a company, as an individual, as a city, or as a nation, had to harness the classical factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But over the course of the past half century, and certainly over the course of the past 20 years, and now with the financial and economic crisis, people tell us that it's a crisis of our banking system, or it's a crisis of overconsumption, a crisis of too easy credit. But really what we are going through is a deep and fundamental shift in the nature and the fundamental underpinnings of our entire economy. You see, we no longer live in that older, bureaucratic, organizational, highly structured, industrial economic age. Now, for the first time in human history, we, across Korea, across Asia, across the United States and Canada, across Europe, across the entire world, have invented a new factor of production. There is a new way to create wealth. And it comes from technology. It comes from information. It comes from knowledge. And in fact, others have offered theories of an information society, a knowledge economy, a technology age. But when you peer deeply into this transformation, you can see that it's based on something even more elemental, even more fundamental. People in the past, great economists and great thinkers, offered that what not only created wealth, what made us human, which gave us the ability to build great buildings, to build giant factories, and to build great agricultural centers, was the ability to use our physical labor. It was our ability to use our physical skilled labor to transform nature that not only created wealth, but made us human. There is something more basic than technology. There is something more fundamental than information. There is something more intrinsically human than the knowledge we acquire. There's something that makes each of us the same, whether we're a boy or girl, male or female, whether we're black or white, Hispanic or Asian, regardless of where we come from or where we live. The most elemental characteristic that we share as humans is our creativity. You see, that's the nature of our time. That's the nature of our age. No longer are we in an industrial economy powered by giant factories and giant industrial complexes. No longer are we simply an economy of bureaucracy and physical skill. We are now more than ever an economy and a society, a set of communities powered by human creativity. This shift from an older industrial order, powered by physical labor, to not only a new kind of economy, to a new kind of society, to new kinds of cities and communities, powered by creativity, is the most momentous shift in human history. When you read the news and you hear about the disruptions in Europe and the economic problems of Greece and Italy, when you hear about the financial turmoil that racked through the United States, what we are really going through is this much, much deeper shift. Two economies, two societies, Two worlds in collision. Those who want to hold on to the old order and cling to the past, cling to those highly bureaucratic structures, those industrial ways of working and ways of life, and a new order, emergent but not yet fully born. A new order pushing up from below. A new order based upon harnessing creativity in all things, in agriculture, in services, in industry, in music, in arts and culture. That's the nature of the shift. And once you understand that, you can understand why our time is so disruptive and so fractured and so fragmented. Let me give you some statistics to understand the power and the nature of this shift from an older industrial order to a newer and better creative one. At the turn of the 20th century, in the United States, the country that I'm from, more than 50% of the workforce, still just a century ago, worked in farms and on the agricultural economy. A growing number were employed in manufacturing. Less than 5% were members of the creative economy, science, technology, innovation, education, research and development, entrepreneurship, the great professions of management, business, healthcare, and education, and the law, arts, culture, entertainment, music, and design. By the year 1950, now more than 50% of the American economy was employed in manufacturing. It was the dawn, it was the apex, it was the zenith of the blue-collar industrial order. Agriculture had shrunk to less than 5% of the workforce. Still less than 10% of all workers were members of the creative class. Science, technologists, innovators, entrepreneurs, business founders, musicians, visual artists, theater producers, graphic designers. Beginning in the 1960s, the world began to change. And during the 1960s, we saw the first glimmers of this new age of human creativity emerging. We saw it first in the arts. We saw it in the great cities of New York and London, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, and then around the world as new artistic and musical forms began to emerge. A counterculture was born. From Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, to James Brown, to the Beatles and Rolling Stones, to Jimi Hendrix and The Who. The nature of a new order bridling against, struggling against the constraints of the old organizational age. But in my book, Rise of the Creative Class, I note that it wasn't the counterculture revolution of the 60s that would power this age, even though it was its first emergent signs. No, it would be in California, in the Silicon Valley, at the outskirts of San Francisco, one of the centers of the counterculture. In the Silicon Valley, not far from Stanford University, were a group of young people, not much older than the students in this audience today, inspired by that new music, just as these young people today were inspired by their music, inspired by the music of that time, by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix and The Who, by that movement towards creativity. The people who began to invent a new technology that would change the world. When Steve Jobs was asked what were his motivations, he said his motivations to create a personal computer and the digital revolution and the iPod and the iPad that would change our world came from that moment. Understanding that the individual and the individual's creativity and ability to express oneself and to create something of true meaning. He and Bill Gates and others would program computers to try to play back their favorite music from the time. In fact, if you look at pictures from the era, they don't look like suited businessmen. They look like, with their long hair and torn jeans, members of that counterculture. By 1980, in the Silicon Valley and then spreading from it to Austin, Texas, and North Carolina, and across the borders to Europe and Asia and throughout the world, a seed of a new order was being born. From 1980 and today, just in the United States, more than 20 million new jobs were created in the creative sector of the economy. Across the world, 200 million. In the United States now, more than a third of the workforce are members of this creative class, the new driving force of our economy. 40 million strong. More than 1 in 3 workers. Larger, far larger than the 20% of workers who toil in industrial jobs in Korea. Today, more than 1 in 5 members of the workforce are members of this emergent creative class. And in the great countries of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, from the Netherlands to Sweden to Denmark to Norway, already more than 45% of the workforce. And in some of the great cities of the world, from New York to London to San Francisco to Washington, D.C., Oslo, Stockholm, Toronto, Vancouver, already more than half of the workforce are members of this great new class. The class that sets the tenor for our times. The class that not only powers economic growth, but is behind the powerful shifts in lifestyles, in dress codes, in modes of working, in modes of living. The creative class. Now, when people hear the word creative class, many believe that it is simply a class of artists, of musicians, of theater directors and actors, of designers, of people who work with artistic creativity. But in fact, it includes entrepreneurs and business builders, those who create new startup companies, those who mold new technology. And it goes deeper than that. Because at the essence of our time is a very simple formula. Every single human being is created. Every single one of us is a creative being. Every little boy and girl, every child in school, everyone who aspires to be involved in the arts or technology, be involved in farming and services and industry, every single one of us, and the key to building better companies, better communities, better societies, the key to overcoming the economic crisis of our time. It's not about better central bank management. It's not about better government policy. It's not about a tax and fiscal stimulus, as the pundits and commentators tell you. It's very simple. It's about stoking that creative furnace that lies deep within every single one of us. You see, I learned this not from studying great artists and musicians. I learned this not from studying artistic and cultural music scenes in great cities. I learned this not even by studying great technology companies like Apple or Google or Facebook. I learned this from studying manufacturing companies many years ago. And when I went to the best manufacturing companies, I noticed something. They didn't see their workers as mere cogs in the machine, as just a source of physical labor. They saw their workers who were making cars and television sets, making all the products that we utilize. They saw their workers as a source of creativity. I learned this from my father. My father was the son of Italian immigrants to the United States. He was born in the 1920s and was in grade school when the Great Depression hit our societies. My father was forced to leave school on the day he turned 13. He put his books down on his desk and he excused himself, and he went down to the employment office in New Jersey and obtained his working papers. He went to work in a factory, a giant brick factory in Newark, New Jersey's industrial district, making eyeglasses. My dad worked in that factory from the day he turned 13. My grandmother worked, my grandfather worked, his 6 siblings worked. It took 9 people to make one family wage. He worked in that factory until the day he retired when he was 65. More than 50 years in one factory. And when I was a young boy of not more than 10 or 11 or 12, I would ask my father to show me where he worked. My father gave me very good advice. He said, "Richard, I work in the factory. That's my job. And I do it because you have a job. And it's your job to go to school and get an education. That's your ticket to success." But I would ask my father time and time again, I would pull on his pants leg and say, "Dad, take me to the factory. I want to see what you do. I want to see where you work." And on Saturdays, when the factory was running overtime, when demand was high, he would take me. And I would enter that factory and watch the machines whirring, making eyeglass frames, printing plastic frames, shaping metal frames, seeing all the styles of eyeglasses being made in the thousands of people, black and white, Hispanic, Latino, Italian, and German, Asian, the thousands of people working in that factory. And I would be watching the machines as they churned. And as my father saw me staring at the machines, he would grab my shoulder. Since I have heard these remarks from almost every great business leader and CEO I have met, but my father told me these words when I was not yet 12 years old. He said, "Richard, it's not the machines and technology that make this factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people who work here." You see, that's the key. And that's the challenge of our time. And that's what our political leaders haven't understood. And that's what our business leaders haven't understood. That's what's not talked about at the G20 or the APEC or at Davos. But that's what we understand. The key to building stronger economies, the key to growth, is to unlock that creative burning desire that lies within each and every one of us. It's a limitless resource. It's not oil or gas or other raw materials or things we take from the earth. It's something that we can grow and grow and grow, and that will make us better off economically and more fulfilled as people. Because all of us want purpose, and all of us want to use that creative energy. And the second fact is, once we understand that creativity is the key to growth, it becomes immediately obvious that creativity annihilates the social categories we have imposed on ourselves. Creativity comes equally in both genders. It doesn't care if you're a boy or a girl. It cuts across every nationality. Black, white, Hispanic, Latino, Asian. It doesn't care about your family or sexual orientation, your religion or ethnicity, where you were born. Creativity requires diversity. It requires openness to new ideas. It requires the ability to self-express. Creativity cannot be contained in old, outmoded social categories, in old, outmoded institutions, in old, outmoded ways of life. Creativity requires individualism and self-expression, the ability to be yourself and find your purpose to flourish. When I studied the place that built the high-tech innovation revolution, when I studied the Silicon Valley that gave birth to Apple and Facebook and Google and all the rest, one thing was striking. More than 50% of the founders of those new companies, more than half of the founders of those new companies were not born in the United States, were new immigrants from Korea or China or India or Europe or anywhere in the world. I boil it down to a simple equation. If you want to succeed in this new age of creativity, there are 3 factors that are critical to the equation. Technology, You need, as an organization, as a city, as a community, as a country, to be a technology leader, but technology alone is not sufficient, because technology can migrate, it can move. You need to have the second T, talent. You need to invest in talent, nurture talent, have great schools and universities that produce talent. But talent too can move. Talent is highly mobile. It can move to better opportunities and the ability to self-express. The third T is critical, tolerance. Technology, talent, and tolerance. The ability to be in a diverse, open-minded, engaging, supportive, inclusive environment. Put all those three T's together, technology, talent, and tolerance. That's the equation for well-being and growth in the creative age. Creativity is the motor force of our economy. Creativity requires diversity. Every single human being is creative. And then there's one last factor, and it's a crucial one. You see, in the age when we were brought up, in our time, over the past 2 or even 3, 4, or 5 decades, we were shaped by a mode of production. We were shaped by a set of institutions which became imprinted on our minds. Ours was the age of the great corporation. IBM, General Motors, Ford, Samsung, Hyundai, and all the rest. Ours was the age when the corporation structured our existence. The industrial corporation, the industrial age, that company, that firm, was the key social and economic organizing unit of our time. Everything from our economic structures to the ways we lived our lives. My father, one job in one company for life. And then we were beset by globalization. And people told us that with the onset of new technology, the information age, better modes of transit and travel, corporations would spread their wings across the globe. Geography was overcome, distance was conquered, and place and community, city and neighborhood would no longer be important. Geography and community were dead. The world, in the words of a great writer, is flat. The world is flat. We can work and we can plug in and play and communicate from anywhere. Well, for some things that's absolutely true. For the most simple tasks, for the most elemental things, that is true. But for what really matters, creativity and innovation, place is more important than ever before. We are more clustered and concentrated. Look at Seoul. Look at this great city, this great cluster or agglomeration. From Seoul to Tokyo, Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, to London and New York and San Francisco. Our world is not flat. Our global world is more clustered and concentrated. The 21st century, if the 20th century was the century of the corporation, my friends, the 21st century is the century of the city. More than 50% of us now live in cities. That will rise to 2/3 by the year 2050. In advanced countries like Korea, like the United States, like Canada, like the countries of Europe, more than 9 in 10 of us live in cities in metropolitan areas. When I look at the world, there are 40 great megaregions. There are more than 200 countries in the world, but just 40 great megaregions. The corridor from Seoul to Busan, from Shanghai to Beijing, the greater Tokyo megalopolitan area, the New York, Boston, Washington corridor, the axis from Mumbai to Bangalore. These 40 megaregions, which house less than 20% of the Earth's population, produce 2/3 of our economic output and 9 in 10 of our innovations. You see, it's the city itself. It's our communities, our metropolitan areas, our mega regions, which are the social and economic organizing unit of our time. In Silicon Valley, it's the region itself which allows entrepreneurs to combine and recombine to form teams. Some of you have heard about the White Stripes, the great band from Detroit, headed by Jack White. And when they asked Jack White, what makes a great city for music? What makes a great music scene? He explained the nature of creativity and the creative city perfectly. He said a great music scene, a great incubator of new musical styles, a great place that forges new music from jazz to rock to hip-hop and rap to alternative and indie music. A great scene allows musicians to competitively combine and recombine, to find other musicians, to find new sounds, a new sonic identity, to find new styles and designs, new ways of dressing and presenting themselves, to combine and recombine to one or two, change the way we hear music and change our culture. That's why the performance was so special to me that we just saw. My work shows that if you can find communities that can create a propulsive and energized, a highly creatified music scene, whether that was San Francisco in the 1960s, or Seattle in the 1990s, or Nashville, Tennessee, or Brooklyn, New York today, you will find a place that can unleash creative energy. And while people who are still tied to the old industrial structure say, that's crazy. New businesses don't come from new music scenes. New businesses come from businessmen building enterprise. No, new enterprises, new entrepreneurial enterprises come out of a creative ferment. When Bono of U2 took the stage recently in Ireland with Bill Clinton and other world leaders talking about the future of his country, Ireland, and the future of economic growth, he told them the truth. He said the key to unlocking economic prosperity no longer lies in just building great ports and great highways and great giant factories. It no longer lies in building just great infrastructure and focusing on the big established companies. He said something happened in the past 20 years that made him and Steve Jobs, and they were very close friends, very similar. It was the nonconformists, the out-of-the-box thinkers, the people who don't fit in, the people who don't quite fit the mold, who can't be contained. He said it was this great shock of nonconformity, of thinking in new ways, of being strange and outside the norm. It's the places that could unleash that could untie that could unlock that were the keys to success. Well, about a decade or two ago, I went to visit Seattle, Washington. And I met with their business leadership, and they showed me a brand new project that was being built in Seattle by the great architect, Frank Gehry. And I asked what the name of the project was, and it was being supported by the co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen. And at first, I thought it was the new Seattle Science Center, believing that founder of Microsoft was motivated to be a great scientist, but it wasn't. I asked if it was a great center of discovery and invention, perhaps believing that co-founder of a great technology company was motivated to be more like the great inventors, like Thomas Edison. It wasn't that at all. I thought maybe it was a center for entrepreneurship and business building, because he was inspired by the great industrialists and business people from Henry Ford and others, John David Rockefeller and others. But it wasn't. You see, the person who motivated the co-founder of Microsoft, one of the richest men in the world, Paul Allen, the person who motivated him, and he called his project the Experience Music Project. It was a musician. A black musician, an African-American musician from Seattle. It wasn't an entrepreneur or a scientist or a technologist. It was the great Jimi Hendrix, an African-American kid who changed the way guitar was played and amplification was used, who changed the way we heard music. You see, creativity lies deep within all of us. Creativity requires diversity. It requires a new way of thinking. It requires an open-mindedness and a nonconformity. It requires we overcome the social categories and institutions. If we're serious about rebuilding our economy, if we're serious about building greater cities, if we're serious about unlocking the key to economic growth, we have to understand that creativity is the key to our time and the future of our children and grandchildren. Thank you for being with me.